waiting for me to actually get here. So we're going to carry on with looking at the inductive study and the questions and how that relates specifically to the small group and what we're doing in that. And so we're going to finish up looking at, we're going to review observation, interpretation, application. I want to hear your process as well. Like Carrie was saying, I tried and I found that I still struggled. That's okay. Thank you for trying. I want to hear some of your where you guys got to. I want to see some of those questions because we're actually going to do it together. We're going to actually run small groups within our staff group. And so I want to hear your process, but I also want to show some more examples of how to move through that process. And then later this morning, we'll talk about some more obstacles to learning. We'll look a little bit about reading comprehension, and then with understanding reading comprehension, that leads very beautifully into how to introduce a book and why introducing a book and how you introduce it is so important to set reading goals for comprehension for the students. Okay, and so that's where we're going to go today with this information. So I want to finish up inductive study and then look at how that filters into everything. Okay, we're good? All right, great. So we're looking at Philemon still. So it would be great if you had your text open, because these questions relate directly to the book itself, and we're trying to ask questions that draw out information from the text and actually lead people through the text. And so therefore having these questions modeled and going through them helps us to understand where we're going and how we get there. So I created some questions for observation as well, but I would did you guys go back and do observation questions more specifically again last night? No, okay. Thank you for your honesty. The interpretation, okay. So I want to start again in observation, because every time we move through the process ourselves, it's good to do the whole thing. And so I last night, I went through the process again for myself. And so I would love to I'm going to share my examples, but I also want to hear your examples. So I don't want it to be like, this is the right way to do it, because that's not the case. Okay, there isn't. It's not about a right or a wrong. It's about how are we moving through the objectives to move the students through the process. And all we're doing is modeling. I'm very different than John. True, I know. It's hard to tell sometimes. It's the glasses that throw people off. But I'm really different, and therefore, that means he's going to approach it slightly different, because his understanding of inductive study is different than mine. And that's not a problem, because if the process is good, the outcome is always good, right? So it's not so much about the details in the process. It's about, am I doing the inductive process? Yeah.
So I've done few, right, since we had our staff leaders meeting and then yesterday, but I was kind of getting confused, because we said that if I just may clarify, and so we said, okay, there are general observations, so people can be pulling out lots of different things, just random observations. But then our intention for our small group is to kind of guide them through significant observations, right? So that could lead it to one direction versus another, because we are really tailoring what is significant and then how these observations are related to each other. Is that like the way? Because where I was getting kind of confused was I was trying to find some not a storyline, but connecting points of the observations. And then I was moving over to the interpretation and application. But I feel like the connecting points of observation led to one thing, but then if I move this way from one observation to the next interpretation to the next application, that came out to something different.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And here's some of the technical complications in creating something like this. One, we have to do the study for ourselves, so that means that we are led through the study. Does that make sense? So we observe, and our observations then lead us to what we see for interpretations of the original hearers and readers, which leads then to principles, which then leads to our personal applications, right? And that process I have to then analyze backwards to then start making observation questions. And so if I'm not aware of my process, or if I'm still learning the process itself, then to go back and to think about it like we're trying to get people to think about, it is actually a complex thing, okay? I am not ashamed to say that it's complex, and it's important to recognize what you're asking the students to do is a complex thing. So what I tried to do yesterday with you is, let's look at some of the observations from the text and move through the text together, and then step back and analyze our process, and then ask leading questions that helped move us through the observation process again. Does that make sense? So I tried to take us all together as a group to see, because some of us need to see that process out loud, need to see that happening, because of our understanding of inductive study is basic, and that's okay. And some of us need refreshed in that way. Some of us, that would have been like, yeah, I could have done it without that. Okay? That's okay. The point is that we all need to know how that process works. Right? We need to know. For me, I have to study myself that passage. I actually have to go through and look at it again. And then I have to actually follow myself to interpretation. I follow what is God actually doing in me this time in Philemon. How many times have I taught Philemon? I don't even know. I've lost count. But what is God doing in me right now with Philemon? So last night, as I'm going through this again for myself, I'm asking God, what are you doing in me now in this time for Philemon? Because when I stand before you today, it's not repetitive. I've done this before. It's actually fresh. And so God was speaking to me last night. This is very exciting to me always. But because I went through it and did it again, right? And then this morning, looking at it again before I come to teach, understanding that there's always a process. Yeah, it's familiar to me, and it's a bit, the complexion is a bit easier because of the practice, right? But that's any skill, yeah? Any skill is like that. You need to know the mechanics before you then, and what I'm asking you to do is a bit fast track that. So if you feel like, whoa, I tried and I'm really just not sure, that's so okay. And so that's part of knowing where you're at, so that when we work together with you in your small group, we can help you walk through that process with where you're at. And that's okay. Because the more you identify where you're at, the more you will identify with your students as they go through the process too. And that's the whole point, okay? So I want to give you the big picture of how it actually works, and then you can identify where you're at in that whole picture. Does that make sense? And I have zero expectation that you would be over on the expert category, okay? I don't feel like I'm in the expert category, okay? But I feel like I can try and teach you how to move a few steps, and that's the whole point of this training time. Awareness, what do I need to learn? Where do I need to go? how do I need to get there? Yeah. So my job as in serving you right now is to move you that one step, which is the same thing that you're going to do with your students. Where are my students? How do I move them to the next step? Cool? Does that make sense? Great, Chris. Thank you for that. Because it is complex. Yeah? So how do we move to the next step for yourselves? Okay. You want to say anything to it? Okay. Just thought I'd ask because I'm looking at Anna because I need her input too in this. She's making sure that it's clear because sometimes Anyway. Okay, so for observation questions, what I did is I'm gonna write what I went through and talk to you about how I went through it again, and then I want to hear you. Okay, I want to hear some of your questions. So again, this is not the right or only way. It's just the way that I did it. Okay, so I started with the question that I asked you yesterday. What is Paul doing in his prayer? Or communicating? And because there's only 5 questions, I'm presupposing that I would have introduced this book with the context. So the genre, right, would have been discussed. A little bit of the historical background would have been given. Okay? And so that's why I can start out with this question. We would have read the book together. And so I'm asking this question because I'm taking people back to the first part of the text. Okay? Then my next question was, which we had talked about as well, where is Onesimus? Where is he supposed to be? Now, the reason I can skip down to that is because I feel like I am not just asking these questions without anticipating responses and where those responses would lead. Does that make sense? So maybe these don't look connected to you, right? But as a facilitator, when I'm asking that first question, I'm thinking about what am I hoping that people are going to say, and then where might that lead? Where might my next point draw out the next part of the text? Where might that actually go? And how can I connect this first part of the text with the next part of the text? And then I'm asking that question in that way. So for example, the next part of the text talks about who Onesimus is and what happened to him. Right? What happened to him? In my imprisonment, he was begotten, so forth and so on. And so the question I'm asking is, well, where is Onesimus? It's clear that in this case, he was with Paul. You see? So, but here, what's Paul communicating? I'm gonna come down with, that's gonna be important to me in interpretation. Right? And so what I'm doing is I'm setting up the scene here. What is Paul communicating? Oh, what's happening in the letter? Right? That's where where's Onesimus? I'm anticipating that that's going to help bring up what's happening, what's going on. Okay? And that's directly from the text. Then, my next question was, what are the relationships? Because I'm anticipating that here's Paul and Philemon's relationship starting. Here's Onesimus and Paul's relationship that I'm highlighting, right? And then I want to now actually highlight the relational aspects specifically. So I would say, my question is, what are the relationships mentioned in the text? And that moves us through into the next part specifically because Paul then begins to ask the questions. He begins to talk about no longer as a slave, brother, partner. Right? And that moves us through so they can re-look at the text that we've already been looking at, and it moves them through the next portion of the text. And so that's why I go with What are the relationships mentioned? Again, these are from my observations, right? We observed these things yesterday. Our observations were pretty much the same, right? So I have to be using what, I know where I got this information from, right? I have to be using my observations because I want them to use observations, right? And so I'm just leading them through the process of discovering observations for themselves because I've already done that and I want to walk them through with me, okay? And then specifically related, so this was a bigger question, but then specifically I'm going to ask about the owing part, right? So my next question would be, what did Paul do for Philemon to owe him himself? Or you can phrase that in a better way, but that's how I phrased it. But basically looking at that owing, because that's significant. That'll be significant in interpretation. For me, when I looked through this, I went back and realized, that's actually a really significant part that's related to here, and then helping understand the shoes of the original readers. That can bring up some of this. This can tie into some of the slavery and historical background stuff. Right, so what did Paul do for Philemon? And that's not super clear in the text, right? And that's okay, because I want them to I want to take them through an observation. Observation is exactly what the text says, but it's also taking them to a level of critical thinking of what could that mean, not in an interpretive way, but in a, okay, this is not necessarily clear. How do I understand this and still stay in the box of observation? What are some potential meanings for these phrases? Does that make sense without interpreting, going like, oh, well, I heard my pastor say once, right? What is it? What think about what this could mean in the context of the passage, of the text itself. Does that make sense?
In our observations, when we ask observation questions, it highlights the things that we still need to find out.
Yeah.
So, the aspect of owing, is there something within the historical context that I need to look up? That's how we actually would have got to slavery, because we didn't do that yesterday, but really I think people knew and had actually studied Philemon first before, and the way that they contributed what to look up yesterday was from a previous encounter with the text. But if we actually went through the text and observed yesterday, we would have came to the conclusion that maybe we should look up slavery so that we can understand the text more. So that's why she's saying you're not getting into interpretation, you're getting observation leads you to look at what do I need to look up. So let's say there's a word in the text and I don't actually know what that word means. Then I need to look it up in a dictionary. You know what I mean? Observation should reveal to us what more we need to find out before we get into interpretation. Okay?
Yes. And so with that, again, I'm anticipating that this is where it will lead us. And so I'm prepared with materials to give to my students of stuff that I found before, and I went through and taken what is significant for interpretation. Does that make sense? So slavery in the New Testament times, well, I don't need to know about slavery in the 400s of the Greek or Roman empires, right? I don't need to know slavery in the Greek Empire, maybe a little bit because they overlapped, but I need to know what it was like in the first century, right? And so there's so much information on slavery in a Bible dictionary. There's stuff on Old Testament. When our students don't know how to use the books quite yet, we're teaching them, look, there's all this information, but here, this is what is relevant to what we're learning, right? And so in the beginning, we're going to give that. We're giving that to them, and hopefully then as we move along, they're adapting and figuring out how to discern what is significant to the text in that time frame. And that's where, again, like I said, this is a complex process, but it's possible for us to model it and lead them through it in a way where they can pick it up specifically and directly. And so, I asked this question because then it exposes where we lack. Yeah, and then I can have a discussion on that. Oh, actually, guys, you need to know more about these systems and how slavery worked and how if you took something of mine, you have to pay me. And if Paul didn't say this, what would have been the implications? Well, he was a thief. Well, how would that look to and then see that naturally leads into interpretation. Well, what about the community then? Right? What would the community say about Philemon and this transaction? Right? And then that naturally can lead into interpretation things. And so I'm doing this specifically because I want to talk about the community. Right? I want to talk about the implications of this in interpretation. That's one of the key parts of the book. Right? So it doesn't matter how you actually get there, but it would be important to move in that direction. And you could get there before me in your third question or whatever, because of the slave aspect. This question could also facilitate that. Okay? And then I asked, and this is what I asked you as well, but following that up, what were the results or what were the intended results of the letter? And so I want to talk about, that helps them think through everything that we talked about. What did Paul really want to see happen? Yeah, what was Philemon's role in that? What was Onesimus's role? What do you think actually happened? Right? Which naturally, again, leads us into interpretation. Let's put ourselves in these people's shoes. Let's use the historical information of, Onesimus would have been traveling with Tychicus with this letter. Can you imagine what it would feel like to show up at the door? Right? That's interpretation. Immediately hopefully we go with asking questions that then I can say, well, what do you think it would feel like to show up at the door? That's an interpretation question that puts us immediately in the shoes of the original hearers and readers, right? So this is my process with observation, and I'm explaining it to you so that you can see how I would have moved through the text in this small book. Now again, because it's a whole book, these questions will be slightly different when it's just a passage. Yeah? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Would somebody else also like to share some of their questions? Please don't compare, okay? It's not about that. It's about let's look at some of the other ways to do this so that it's more than just one model. What are some questions you guys came up with? Don't be shy now. Come on, I'm going to start picking people. I can.
The sequence of questions that you want the sequence or just any question?
I'm happy to have the sequence if you'd like to share that with us. If it's too exposing, then just share with me one or so of your questions.
I think a lot of, maybe some of these were already mentioned yesterday, but one of the things I did was why did, excuse me, why did Paul mention that he wrote this letter in his own hand?
Yeah.
In verse 19.
Yep. So instead of using a why question, you could reframe that with what does it mean that he wrote this with his own hand, which is good. That's an excellent question. Okay, good. What else? Do you want to keep going with those?
Okay. Another question I had was, what was the expectation how is Onesimus to be treated by Philemon?
Great. Excellent. Then that leads us back to the text. Exactly. Great. Those are good. Others?
I just wonder, what exactly did he mean when he said, I'm a prisoner for Christ Jesus?
Excellent.
I mean, was I a thief and got caught and got converted in jail? Well, we know that wasn't the case with Paul, but...
That's a wonderful thread to follow. That's one of my favorite threads. Anyway. That's excellent. Because that really brings in a lot of the historical background. How did Paul get there? Why does he say prisoner of Jesus and not prisoner of Rome? So forth and so on, right? Beautiful line of thought. Thanks, Randy. What else?
What's the reason that Paul sent Onesimus to Philemon? Because he needs him.
Excellent.
But then he sent.
Excellent. You guys are getting the hang of it. I like it. She said, what is the reason that Paul sent Onesimus back? Obviously, he says he needs him, so, right? Good. What else? Anybody else want to volunteer? Ellie, what do you got?
I just said, what is he trying to communicate through his word choice? And
Good.
What words does Paul use to speak to Philemon?
Great. Yes, looking at which words he actually uses. That's so valuable because he is very specific in his choice of words. Good. Awesome. Vicky, did you want to share one?
Yeah, well, it's kind
Similar,
of the
yeah.
same thing. Like, what tone does he use?
Great. Tone.
Trying to get to, does Philemon have a choice?
Great. That's a very important thread that could come up, right? That's a very important thread. Good. I like that thread too. So again, you see how different? It's not only one way.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when people ask why questions, you said change that to what are the reasons? But don't they both kind of relate into interpretation?
Yeah.
So what's the difference?
The reason I personally try to stay away from using why in observation is because I want why to be a bridge into interpretation. Because, for example, what am I wearing?
You're wearing a shirt and shorts and sandals.
Okay, great. Why am I wearing this?
It's hot today.
Good guess, because it's hot today. Any other guesses? I don't own any other clothing. That's a good guess. I need to do laundry. I have nothing else to wear. Right?
You wanted to wear that necklace, so you wanted.
I wanted to wear the blue necklace, so I matched my blue shirt with my blue necklace because I really wanted the necklace, right? There's a bazillion reasons why maybe I chose this outfit, right? So the why question is a bit more vague and not necessarily so clear as what, who, where, when, and how. Does that make sense? So that's why I use the what, or reframe those questions in observation, because when I move into interpretation, I want to use the why to gather all my information. So for example, do you know that I own other clothes? That's an observation. right? You observed me wearing other clothes, therefore this is not my only outfit. Unless I stole them, right, okay. Which hopefully you would observe my character and know that I'm not a thief. Right? So there's all these observations, and what we're trying to do is then move into then the why, use those clues to move into the why is it like that? That's why, great question.
Why did you choose your outfit?
Why did I choose my outfit? Because this shirt was nice and airy, and it is hot. It was hot in here yesterday. Yeah, and it's comfortable.
But that question, like that Chris asked,
Yeah,
why did he mention that he loved me? It also is just like, what did Paul do? For it exposes that I need to understand historical context of what does he mean when he says that. But I'm not actually yet asking what
Why he said
to
it.
the original hearers and readers
Right.
in the context of what he's saying with his message. Does that make sense? And so it's a good bridge question
yeah,
to easily take into interpretation. And so that's what you're saying, if you keep it to the what, it helps people to distinguish facts
yeah.
rather than
Opinions. Yeah. It's good. Did you want to?
One of the questions be, what is it about a home church?
What do you mean?
Because I think there's like a reason that Paul, he could have just been to Philemon, but it says to Philemon and Apphia and
Archippus,
this,
those in your
to the
church.
church in your home.
Yes, absolutely. So a question that would highlight then is, to whom is this letter written? Right? And then when you move into interpretation, why didn't he just say Philemon? If it's a personal letter, how come Apphia?
So in this observation that you said, it could just be something as basic as to whom is this letter written?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then you would want to pick that back up in interpretation. How come the rest of the church is mentioned? Why do you think that that's the case? I know why I think that's the case.
Because Paul, well, I mean, that's interpretation if I say cousin.
Right. So, but I know based on what I understand about what's happening with the text, what the main idea of the text is, what's going to be required of Philemon if he does this, and the support that he needs, right? And the accountability, and so forth and so on. So, like that, if you want to go in that thread, then you need to help them as you go through to bring out things like, it's a big ask. He's going to need support. The implications are big if he doesn't, the implications are big when he does, or if he does, take him back. That's a big deal implicationally in the community.
Right.
Right. So if you want to follow that thread,
My own
yeah.
thing that I pulled at the very end is this is a communal thing of what the reason Paul did this is because he wants the whole community to see how to handle something like this maybe.
Right. So then when you go through these questions, then you have to prepare them for that. And see, that's the thing with when I study and I know where I went to community and community thing, right? Then when I go back and make these questions, I know where I've gone, and I'm analyzing where did I go and how can I help highlight that, right? Maybe you are asked that and somebody goes off in a totally different direction. That's okay.
So when you're talking about if you're trying to get to the accountability in the community, then you could also bring in why did Paul ask Philemon to prepare a guest room, because Paul is also coming.
Yep, absolutely. Again, like I said, because this is the whole book, there's so many points of application or interpretation and then principles that we're pulling out. And so we've just mentioned like 6 principles that those threads could easily go to, right? Hopefully in a smaller passage of scripture, or no, not hopefully, deliberately through the DBS, the passages of scripture that are being discussed in your small group are related specifically to the outcomes of each week. Okay? So it won't be as big and as vague and as so many threads, because what the idea is the reason those scriptures are being discussed in the small group is modeling and inductive study, but also they're helping move us along in this process so that we can actually have some principles. We know where we got them from the text. We know how that's related to the biblical era of this time. So for example, in the first week, we're looking again at worldview origins. Where do we come from? How do we know, this foundational stuff? And then if you're looking into the Pentateuch, right, we're looking at more like there's these threads of holiness and things. So those passages will be directly related to the outcomes for that week, which is in your packet, right? And so it won't be as big and as vague, and I think it's it'll be a little less complicated, and a little less, it'll be more directive, because the purpose of discussing it in this way is to model the skill, but also to give the underpinning knowledge of where in the Bible do these things come from, right? Why is covenant so significant? It's such a significant part of the whole Bible. Let's have a discussion on covenants. Let's actually let's break down a covenant. Things like that. And so they're deliberate because they're moving us through the materials of what we really want the students to have a foundation for in the text, in the Bible, so they can leave and do this in other parts of the Bible for themselves. Yeah? Does that make sense? So I know that right now, it's a bit abstract, and I'm teaching you a skill, but I want to model it with Philemon, because we're going to get them and we're going to just introduce Philemon to them and introduce inductive study using Philemon. So I want you guys to be able to be like, oh, I see, right? And understand a little bit of how the skill works and be able to work through that in something that maybe is familiar to you already, because Philemon can be very familiar for us who've done inductive study before, or it's easier to understand if we haven't done inductive study. That's why I'm using Philemon. Questions on that process? Do you want to move into interpretation? You guys want to keep going? I think it's important to keep going so that we can see, so you can see how these are related. How did I then use interpretation questions connected to these? Okay.
But sometimes your leading observation question can be simple.
That's correct. Sure, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. The idea, though.
If it takes them down the right path.
Yeah,
you want it.
Absolutely.
You're
No.
saying, like, who's the author of this letter was important for the that I chose.
Exactly. Ideally, you would have had a previous discussion about who is the author in the historical, giving like Paul wrote this from here in this place.
You do that before you even.
Yeah, in the introduction to the book. So we're going to talk about how to introduce a book and what directive things. But first, before talking about introducing a book, I want to talk about reading comprehension, because when we're introducing a book, we're introducing it for a reason and to prepare people for comprehending the text, which is a different skill than just reading for pleasure, remember? And so there's important things we can set them up with to help facilitate retaining, understanding, and having some goals that can help them be directive as they're reading, instead of just reading for whatever reading's sake, right? Okay. Interpretation. Okay, so I went with, in relation to, okay, what is Paul doing in his prayer? He's commending. So then I'm asking here in interpretation, why... Why is the commendation in this situation important? Does that make sense? Why I asked that question? So I'm asking why, obviously, Paul thought it was significant to start out his letter this way. Right? Why would that be important for the original receiver, Philemon? Yeah? What are the implications of starting it this way? How is that helpful for Philemon? Is it helpful for Philemon? Why would that be helpful? Why would it be helpful for the church that's also receiving this letter? Right? And so that's the kind of track. We have that foundation, and I can go back to it and say, well, if, let's think about it. He starts off with a commendation. Is that because Paul wants to butter people up? Is it because he's just a smooth operator? Like, is he, you know what I mean? Like, is he just blowing smoke? Really? Is he just saying nice things to say nice things? Or was he deliberate? Is it flattery for flattery's sake? There's so many things. What does this tell us about Paul's character? What does this tell us about Philemon's character? So that's where this question, I'm thinking about all those things and related to interpretation that I have gone through in interpretation. And this is my question that I come out of that with to help lead my group. Yeah? Do you see how that works? Why is commendation in this situation important? And maybe that's not something you've thought about for yourself. That's okay, right? Again, there are different ways of doing this for us. Okay. Then I asked, why would Paul appeal versus ordering? Right? Because that's, again, that second part of the text. So here, the first part of the text, commendation in this situation. Now, again, second portion of the text, it's the appeal. Why would he say appeal versus order? He says he has confidence to order. Why doesn't he? Why would he appeal? Why is that significant? Why would that be significant to Philemon? Why is that significant to Onesimus? Why is it significant to the church? Right? So I'm bringing all these people in, asking the significance question and making sure that I'm relating it to the stuff that we know about the church. Right? Is that clear? Okay. Then I would ask, in this case, right? Or what's the value of relationship terms, or why are these relational terms so important and related to this particular? So I'm taking observation of relational terms and talking about their significance to these individuals because of what I just talked about with the appeal. How would these terms help Onesimus, Philemon to move in the direction that Paul is hoping that they move in, right? So I'm looking at the specific terms and talking about how those play a part in interpretation. So I might need to go back a little bit. Like, it looks like I'm going back to observation. I am. I'm going back to those words that we highlighted, right? Brother, brother, brother. I want to bring out that principle. What would it mean to them? So we've observed that relational terms are important. Brother, 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 what would the implications of that be for them? Right? So you can ask technical things. You've asked them, observe them, but then you can actually take those technical things and look at it from the viewpoint of the original hearers and readers. So maybe my question doesn't actually, but I wanted to communicate, it's that we're taking those terms, not just what we would think that they mean, because I know what I think brother, brother, brother means, but how about in this situation? With this complicated, what would that mean, right? Okay, and then Why do you think Paul would need to make statements about paying back Philemon? So this is just picking up some of those threads that you guys talked about, specifically related to what did Paul do for Philemon to owe him himself. I'm picking up why would he need these kinds of statements? So drawing in from the historical context and the complication of what he's asking him to do implicationally in the community. Why are these statements because the next question I'm going to ask, and how I'm going to ask this is looking at the thread I want to go to with this one is that Paul removes any obstacle and any barrier from Philemon's capacity to obey. And any excuse or anything that could be like, oh, I can't take you back because there wasn't financial restitution, right? And if there isn't financial restitution, then I am obligated by the law to punish him, right? And so where I'm going with this is looking at, you could look at this in many ways, in relational forgiveness. How do I remove obstacles in my life, right? So this is trying to highlight how Paul removed every obstacle from this relationship barrier. He looked at the community barriers and he moved into all of those things. Yeah, and he pulled about every stop. So then I would then move in application, would move straight in from here saying, hey, am I removing any barriers to forgiveness? Am I championing, relationships in people? Or do I see a brokenness and I just say, that's not my job? Right? Here Paul is showing us that to remove everything. Okay, so where do I do that? Do I go the extra mile? Am I willing to pay for somebody else's mistake? It's not my thing. Right? And so that, again, immediately I know where I want to go. And so it didn't make sense until I told you where I want to go with those statements. Yeah, so there's application that can come directly out of that. Same with some of those observations. You're like, how does that work? Well, that feeds right into interpretation, which for me then feeds into application. So I'm thinking about my process. Yeah? And so the last question is, why is Paul so confident? And this is looking at Philemon's character, right? And then I can talk about character things. I can move straight into application questions, asking questions about character, right? So then I ask application questions. Equality. Yeah, so I'm following this thread here. Commendation, right, encourages people to know who the Apostle Paul sees Philemon as. A reputable man who has refreshed hearts, who is going to be asked to be refreshed, right? Refreshing both Onesimus and Paul in this situation. Therefore, I can move into, the appeal and order. Well, this is a request because in order to refresh, it can't be out of compulsion. You can't force people to love. You can't force people to receive. You can't force people to have forgiveness, right? Relational terms. I'm brother. I'm not a slave master. I'm changing my idea about world view, right? So when I look at things, how am I doing this? How am I moving in these directions to help them get into application? So how do I make choices to commend? Am I commending people? Am I highlighting what is valuable about people, or am I really just slandering people behind their back? Yeah, how do I personally build people up? Yeah, as a person, I'm going to be a staff, okay? How am I building my students up? How am I building my other staff up? How am I building my leadership up, right? So what do I see? Do I only see what is wrong, or do I try to highlight what is good? You know, that's where these things can lead. And so ideally what I'm trying to do is draw out some principles from these interpretation questions. And so I would, in my process, write down my principles that I see. Okay, now I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to see all the principles, but I would start writing down principles so that if somebody went that direction, I could say, yes, yeah, I see that principle. And here's an application question I've thought of related to that principles. Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to help people become reflective about these principles and learn how to ask application questions for themselves immediately, so that they have something, they know where it came from, they can follow that process through with you in the small group, and they think, man, I have just been terrible at the way that I haven't been using my words in commending people. I mean, I've been just tearing people down, actually. I've been doing it in my heart, and sometimes it spills out, and I really need to look at that. And so that at the end of the week, they're looking at their application question and they're writing reflection questions related to that principle. How am I doing with this? Man, I realize, and they're journaling or they're writing through their process in the application, because that's what God nailed them on that week. That's where the Holy Spirit was really moving in them. They're going to take that as their application and reflect on that and come to a statement. I will every day find someone and specifically encourage them once a day, right? It's provable, possible, measurable. And so I go to Jeremiah, I realize this is my application. I really need you to hold me accountable. I've noticed that I've just been tearing people down, and I want to practice encouraging people. Would you hold me accountable? I'm going to encourage one person a day. At the end of the day, can you check with me and make sure? Just text me, be like, did you encourage someone today? I really need to grow in this area. Jeremiah was like, yeah, done. Right? That's the idea of where we're going with this. So the questions lead us to principles, which lead us to application questions, which the students pick which one God is dealing with them. Hopefully they're aware, and that's where we're going to be training. We want awareness. What is actually God doing? Oh, I remember this question from Tuesday's small group. Remember this principle? That seems fitting, because sometimes people don't connect those things. We're going to help connect that. They reflect on it, and that's where the application assignment comes in. To see this process? Any questions about how and where this is going? Again, what this looks like. You think it's possible? I'm with you, okay? We will help you. We're gonna practice the next 3 days. We're gonna practice the first week so that you feel comfortable and prepared. We're gonna do this together, okay? We're gonna walk through it.
And I think it will be easier once we have
just your passage.
A passage
Yeah.
will be a lot easier in this. But students in the beginning, like you said, are not even to the copy point of this stage, so
Right.
their interpretations are not going to look as concise as yours.
Nope.
And they might only have, I do feel a lot of students could come up with, accommodation is important. Paul is very loving in this letter. He
Yep.
spends a lot of time saying how good they're doing.
Yep.
So a lot of people could come to an application like, oh, I should be more encouraging, or
Yep.
even a appeal thing. And so in terms of, I was thinking like grading
Yeah.
or whatever, as long as they're not going outside the boundaries of the book and
Yep.
drawing is the end goal for us in terms of what we see on like their homework or whatever, is like if they're coming out with a principle that is good, that they can practically apply, and we see that they're diligently pursuing their application. Is that the end goal for IBS?
The end goal would be that they know a process. They actually know how to do the process.
We're not expecting them to do it.
But we're not expecting them to do that in an expert level by any means. We're expecting them to maybe be at the copy stage.
So it's not more grading the quality, it's more grading the
process.
The process of it, that they're putting their heart into it and trying their best to draw out a principle that is found within the book that we see they're pursuing in their lives.
That's correct.
On a daily basis.
That's correct. And we're looking at where are they in that process and how can I this next week move them to doing that process better. Yeah. Right. And I don't have the expectation that they would be able to do that until the end of the course. They would be capable of fully doing that by the end of the course. Right? And they're going to model that they're going to try it themselves in weeks 9, 10, and 11. But we're going to use all those weeks up into that time to prepare them, right? So as far as grading them, did they get it? Right? Did they make an effort? Are they moving from where they were? Yep. Good. We can begin grading that, right? Like here's where they started. That's great. This is where they need to be. My job is to get them there. Okay? How can I help them? Are they moving? Why are they moving? Why are they not moving? What are the issues? Is it a skill issue? Is it a character issue? Is it a knowledge issue? Where can I bring in more knowledge? Where can I bring in more skill? Where can I help them with their character? And that's it. Good. Other thoughts, questions? Good? Okay, why don't we just take then our break? Are we good for break? Yeah, he went to get plates. Okay. And then when we come back, we'll look at reading comprehension and how to introduce a book.